Welcome to the press conference following our 29th EU-Japan summit. Just let me remind you that we have translation into Japanese, English and French for those following remotely. We're about to publish the statement that was adopted, and I first give the floor to the President of the European Council, please.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Prime Minister Kishida, dear Fumio, dear Ursula. It's a pleasure to welcome you here in Brussels. Today, Japan and EU cooperation is as strong and positive as ever. And I would like to thank you, dear Fumio, dear Prime Minister, for your leadership and personally for your friendship. Japan is one of the EU's staunchest allies, and Japan is our closest partner in the Indo-Pacific region. Today, we agreed to work for greater security and prosperity for our people and to generate more opportunities for our businesses. Our shared values are the bedrock of our relationship: democracy, rule of law, and multilateral cooperation. Japan's support to the people of Ukraine has been impressive. As the current G7 chair, you have stood resolutely in backing Ukraine and condemning Russia. And just yesterday, in Vilnius, we, G7 leaders, committed to ramping up our support for Ukraine and increasing the pressure on Russia. The EU and Japan are also working together to bolster peace and security on the Korean Peninsula. North Korea's nuclear program and wasteless missile tests like the one yesterday threaten regional and international security. We condemn these in the strongest possible terms. The Indo-Pacific is a vibrant and growing region, a key player in shaping global affairs. In the EU, we are stepping up our engagement with your region. Our 27 member states are united on China. Recently, the European Council reaffirmed its multifaceted approach. Both China and the EU have an interest in a stable and constructive relationship. We will engage to tackle global challenges, but these are issues that need to be addressed: level playing field, reciprocity, and a balanced economic relationship. We will diversify and de-risk where appropriate. We will always promote our values and our interests. Today, we agree to deepen our exchanges on all these issues. We are also taking a step forward in our cooperation on security, and we agreed to launch a strategic dialogue that will also include security and defense, and this will boost our cooperation in areas like maritime security or cyber and hybrid threats. Today, we also identified key projects that will help us achieve our green and digital goals, like the hydropower storage project in Vietnam that will assist in phasing out coal and driving forward the green transition, or the Northern Corridor project in East Africa that will improve trade and transport connectivity in that region. Economic resilience is a top priority for both Japan and the EU. We agreed to step up our strategic cooperation to reinforce our supply chains, especially in critical raw materials like rare earths. The EU and Japan are also powerful engines in protecting our planet. In the run-up to COP28, we agreed to cooperate more in areas that will drive forward our green transition, like solar supply chains, offshore wind, grid technology, and energy efficiency. And we are also boosting cooperation on hydrogen production. Ladies and gentlemen, just last year, bilateral trade between Japan and the EU increased more than 13%, and now we are building on that momentum. We specifically discussed improving market access, and today the EU agreed to again allow the import of products from the Fukushima region. EU foods will also get better access to Japanese markets. This is another sign of trust and cooperation. Dear Prime Minister Kishida, dear Fumio, Japan and the European Union share a genuine bond that we can be proud of. We are reliable partners. We are reliable friends for greater peace and security in the world, and that will continue. I thank you.
Thank you, Mr. President. Madam President, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Charles. And thank you, Prime Minister Di Fumio. Yesterday, we were together in Vilnius as partners at the NATO summit. We discussed our cooperation in Europe and the Indo-Pacific. And today, we are here together in Brussels at the EU-Japan summit, a very clear message of partnership and friendship. We share with Japan the analysis that from Ukraine to the Indo-Pacific, the world is one security theatre. And also in Vilnius, the G7 under Japan's presidency and the European Union made very clear that security commitments to Ukraine are vital. We stand by Ukraine as we have done since the beginning of the Russian aggression. At the same time, with our Indo-Pacific strategy, we are also increasing our engagement in the region because we know that Indo-Pacific security and European security are indivisible. And I'm pleased that we are launching a strategic dialogue to coordinate on these unprecedented challenges to peace and security. And this includes, of course, also the vital topic of economic security. This is my first point. We've seen supply chain disruption caused by the pandemic and Russia's invasion in Ukraine. We've seen cyber attacks and economic coercion. All that has been a wake-up call for us. Economic security is of vital importance and a common concern. We agreed to coordinate on these issues at the G7 level, and now we are launching a bilateral dialogue on economic security as well. As you all know, Japan is a front runner in this area. We, the European Union, have just developed our own economic security strategy. So I believe that we have a lot to gain from working together on this topic. We share similar dependencies. We both see the need to de-risk our supply chains. So one of our objectives is to reduce over-reliance on a handful of suppliers, many of them based in China, for products that are vital for our economies. For instance, critical raw materials. I'm very pleased that we are concluding a cooperation arrangement on raw materials between the European Commission and Japan. The same goes for semiconductors. And I'm glad that we have also concluded a memorandum of cooperation on the issue of semiconductors. It will cover, for example, monitoring the supply chains. It will cover the very important aspects of research and, of course, the important aspect of advanced skills for these industries. Skilled personnel is badly needed. The second point that I want to emphasize is that we have taken stock of our economic partnership agreement. It is now in force since 4 years, and it is delivering. Trade flows have increased by 20%, and this despite the COVID pandemic. But we also know that we can do much more. Therefore, on our side, the European Union side, we agreed to lift the remaining restrictive import measures that were linked to the Fukushima accident. We have taken this decision based on science and based on the proof of evidence and based on the assessment of the International Atomic Energy Agency. And we also agreed to solve several other trade issues in the course of this year, in particular, the access for our agricultural products to the Japanese market. The third topic I want to mention is the stepping up our cooperation on digital. We have launched our digital partnership a year ago. Since then, we have made good progress on connectivity. For example, an exciting project that is we will deploy an Arctic submarine cable that delivers high capacity and secure connections between Europe and Japan. And now we go one step further. we will work on 6G, we will work on high-performance quantum computing and cybersecurity. So the whole agenda of the digital partnership is growing and is getting more dense and concrete. Most importantly, we will cooperate on artificial intelligence. This has two legs. Of course, on one hand, we want to reap its benefits, but on the other hand, we also see the risks and we want to manage the risks. My fourth point is on clean tech and the energy transition. For that, we have our Green Alliance. It's the first Green Alliance the European Union ever concluded here with Japan. And now we are teaming up to deploy renewable energy, in particular offshore wind and clean hydrogen in Europe and in Japan. And in parallel, we are investing together in sustainable infrastructure around the world. On the European Union side, this is our investment program. You are well aware of Global Gateway. And there's a similar investment program on the Japanese side. Together, we are showing results, for example, from a hydropower storage project in Vietnam, to railway infrastructure in Indonesia, or to transport corridors in Africa, just to name a few examples. Finally, I shared our experience with carbon pricing, which is a very good way to reduce emissions while generating revenues for the clean energy transition, and it was interesting to hear the plans on the Japanese side. So in conclusion, it was an excellent summit with tangible outcomes. We need each other more than ever for our security and our economic resilience, and we are closer than ever. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Madam President. Prime Minister Kishida, you have the floor.
I am immensely pleased that today, upon visiting Brussels, President Michel of the European Council, President von der Leyen of the European Commission, and myself met in person for the annual Japan-EU Summit. First, the decision by the EU to lift import restrictions on Japanese food will provide strong support to the reconstruction of the affected area. The government of Japan highly values and welcomes the decision. The views agreed upon at the G7 Hiroshima summit that any unilateral attempt to change status quo by force is unacceptable anywhere in the world, and that we shall continue to work closely towards maintaining and strengthening a free and open international order based on the rule of law were again reaffirmed at today's meeting. Especially as we face a severe security environment, we welcome the stronger engagement by the EU in the Indo-Pacific. Japan and the EU will establish a strategic dialogue at the foreign ministerial level and further strengthen cooperation in extensive areas, including security. We agree to deepen our dialogue and cooperation in economic security as well. The economic security strategy released by the EU on the 20th of June is based on fundamental principles common to Japan's basic position on economic security and is highly appreciated by the government of Japan. We also welcome the new administrative arrangement established on this occasion on cooperation over critical raw materials. It is important to build on such concrete cooperation. Based on our agreement at last year's annual summit to launch a Japan-EU digital partnership, the council meeting was held among relevant ministers on the 3rd of this month, and then on the next day, the 4th of this month, the Memorandum of Cooperation between Japan and the EU on semiconductors was signed. These are milestones that we very much welcome.
Also, rapid development and take-up of AI, especially generative AI, is an important challenge with the EU as well as for entire international community. I will convene in this autumn G7 leaders online meeting centering around the theme of generative AI. Through Hiroshima AI process, agreed at the G7 Hiroshima Summit, as G7 presidency country, we will lead international discussions on generative AI. Further, building on Japan-EU partnership on sustainability, sustainable connectivity and quality infrastructure, projects were identified for Japan-EU cooperation from the perspective of strengthening engagement with Global South. As well, we will step up our cooperation with the EU. Also, based on Green Alliance, strengthening cooperation further in climate change, energy, as well as in global health, was affirmed. Especially in hydrogen area, a number of cooperative projects are already ongoing, such as technology development, cooperation in automobile area, and cooperation in green hydrogen production. To strengthen these efforts, Japan-EU cooperative framework will be launched at the leaders level with pillars of industry, finance, and technology with the leaders' involvement. Japan-EU are top runners on hydrogen area by advancing rulemaking for hydrogen distribution, global rollout of technology and production, and building large-scale supply chain. Hydrogen society will be realized toward achieving carbon neutrality. On regional and international situation, candid exchange of views took place. On responses to Russia's aggression against Ukraine, to end the aggression as swiftly as possibly can, continuation of severe sanctions against Russia and strong support for Ukraine, and engagement with countries, including Global South, to respond in much more reinforced way in unity amongst the international community were reaffirmed. On China, importance was affirmed on direct communication with China on our common concern and seeking to act as a responsible member of the international community, working together with China on global challenges like climate change and common areas of interest, and building constructive and stable relations through dialogue. On North Korea, yesterday on the 12th, ICBM-class ballistic missile was launched. Like seen there is an increased nuclear and missile activities on the part of North Korea, where we share the grave concern. And in responses to North Korea, including the abduction issue, Japan and EU will work together closely, was affirmed. To be able to issue joint statement as an outcome of today's summit would be a very significant message to the region and to the international community. I will remain in close cooperation with President Michel of the European Council and President von der Leyen of the European Commission. Thank you.
Thank you, Prime Minister, for your remarks. We'll first be taking a couple of questions from the Japanese media, and we have a question from TV Asahi. Yes, please.
Thank you very much. Chiji Iwa, TV Asahi. I have a question to Prime Minister Kishida. Each of the leaders mentioned the lifting of the import restrictions against Japanese food. the decision on lifting the restrictions was adopted. This restriction continued for a long time. What kind of discussion took place that had led to this decision to lift the restrictions? On a related topic, the government will shortly begin the discharge of treated water to the sea. Were there any discussions on this matter? And if yes, were you able to gain the understanding of the EU? Another major agenda item for this meeting was economic security. President von der Leyen mentioned the word China. And in the economic security context, how will Japan cooperate with the EU and partner with the EU in economic security? Thank you. Thank you very much. You asked 3 questions to myself, and let me respond to those questions. First of all, on the decision to lift import restrictions on Japanese food. At the annual Japan-EU summit held moments ago, President von der Leyen of the European Commission briefed us on the decision by the EU to lift the import restriction. To date, the government of Japan has been taking every opportunity available to call upon the EU and its member states at all levels to lift the restrictions sooner than later. The decision by the EU will push forward the recovery and reconstruction of the affected area, and it is based upon science, robust science, so we very much value and welcome that decision. On Alps-treated water.
You also asked me a question on that. On Alps-treated water, Japan explained that from the perspective of reconstruction from Great Eastern Japan earthquake, ocean discharge of Alps-treated water is important. And second, while being reviewed by IAEA based on scientific evidences, Japan is responding in transparent manner. And 3, in IAEA's comprehensive report, it concluded that ocean discharge is consistent with international standards and impact is negligible on people and environment. EU welcomes that Japan is responding in a transparent way, and IAEA report was announced. In the joint statement this time also, these points will be iterated. Your third point about the economic security. Well, with regard to the economic security strategy announced by EU converges with the basic thought of Japan on the economic security. We welcome this direction as like-minded countries and partners. On supply chain and critical infrastructure resilience, responses to economic coercion, and appropriate management of sensitive technology, it's important that Japan and EU and like-minded countries coordinate and respond in one voice to economic security, as well as toward de-risking and take necessary measures steadily. And in this sense, importance is attached to G7 framework agreed at the Hiroshima summit. As G7, we like to deepen strategic coordination and cooperation and reinforce further cooperations on individual concrete matters. Based on the outcome of this Japan-EU summit, we hope to deepen further between Japan and EU as well, dialogue and cooperation in economic security area. Those are the responses I made to you on the 3 points asked. Thank you.
Prime Minister, we have another question by Mainichi Newspapers. Yes, please.
Mainichi Newspaper, my name is Tanabe. Thank you very much for this opportunity. President Michel and President von der Leyen, I have questions to you. Regarding the lifting of the decision on food imports, you said decision was handed down. What will be the timing when the lifting will actually be put into force? And what are the reasons behind the decision to lift those restrictions? And EU and NATO, regarding China, which is thought to be close to Russia, how does the EU and NATO tend to face Russia or China? Thank you. China that is close to Russia.
On your first point, a dialogue began a while ago with the Japanese authorities to lift the import restrictions. And Prime Minister Kishida, I think, perfectly summed up the state of our relations and our work on this. We base ourselves on objective data, and particularly the report of the International Atomic Energy Authority. It's on the basis of that we decided to lift restrictions. Now we have to implement this decision, make sure it's operational. Now, in parallel to that, could I also point out that with the Japanese authorities, we are working to facilitate access of agricultural products, beef, fruit and vegetable, in particular, access of these EU products to Japan. So that's the first point. Your second question about the EU and NATO, well, of course, cooperation between the EU and NATO has been strengthened significantly, and several initiatives have been taken also between Japan and NATO. And I think this shows that we believe that the security challenges are global in nature, and we are always partners with those who believe in a rule-based world and who face the same challenges as us. We are facing a challenge because of the war that was triggered by Russia against Ukraine. We're also facing challenges such as the instability and insecurity created by North Korea. So together we have to work to prevent threats to our stability and our security, both in Europe and in the Indo-Pacific.
To the first question, the EU import restriction measures linked to the Fukushima accident have always been based on scientific grounds. So now we lifted the measures as of today, based on the latest evidence that has been provided by Japan, and this is done with the agreement of the member states. I want to thank the Japanese authorities because you have provided regular updates on the Fukushima status in a timely and in a transparent manner. This process also shows the reliability on both sides. In Vilnius, there were many topics on the agenda. One of the topics that came up was, of course, also the topic of economic security. And you know the three elements that are in our strategy dominant. It is, first of all, to promote our own resilience, so to increase the resilience of our own economy. This is very important, the competitiveness of our own economy. Then to protect, this is basically to make sure the vast majority of trade is completely uncomplicated. What we have to make sure is that is a level playing field for our companies as it is reciprocal for other companies, but also to make sure that cutting-edge technology is not being used to increase military capabilities somewhere else. And the third element, and this is what I want to reflect on here at the summit, is to partner with country. If we de-risk, not decouple is the headline for our concept, also yesterday in the discussion. If we de-risk, we have to be well coordinated so that it does not go at the expense of each other. And therefore, for example, our memorandum of cooperation on semiconductors that we concluded is a brilliant example that we coordinate in the semiconductors on the cooperation in research. Here, for example, the brilliant IMEC that is based in Belgium, and development, that we have early warning mechanism in case that there are critical disruptions in supply chains of semiconductors, and of course that we work together on the advanced skills for the semiconductor industry. So this is a living example, a living proof for how you can, in a well-coordinated manner, de-risk and work together so that it is for the benefit for all of us.
Thank you. We'll be taking, yes, Philip, from the EU side. Philip Blenkinsop from Reuters.
Yeah, Philip Blenkinsop of Reuters. I just wanted to have a bit more information. You mentioned, obviously, in terms of food, that you'd agreed to solve issues in relation to EU products' access to Japanese market. I think you, Mr. Michel, mentioned beef, vegetables. Maybe you can just clarify what the issue is. And then just on economic security in general, obviously you've got, you'll be discussing supply chains, diversification. You have, for example, a memorandum of understanding on semiconductors. What sort of concrete results might one expect from this dialogue in time?
You want to go first?
Madam, yes.
So, it is agricultural products, a certain variety of agricultural products that had trade barriers accessing the Japanese market. And here we hope and we're confident that there will be an improvement for the agricultural sector to access on a level playing field the Japanese market. What the economic security is concerned, as I said, Japan is a front runner. Japan was, if not the first country, to develop the principles of economic security. And we've learned a lot from Japan where that is concerned. You also see it in our economic security strategy that the Commission tabled. The principle that we developed, the de-risk, not decouple, says very clearly, first of all, de-risk, not decouple diplomatically. So mentioned by Prime Minister Kishida, here also in this press conference, the dialogue that has to be kept open. Not only a dialogue on topics where we agree, but also a dialogue on topics where we disagree to avoid misunderstandings. That's point number one. But economic security, of course, has then a strong emphasis on the economy. And indeed, here is a variety of different topics that you can look at. It starts with the over-dependency on certain products, for example, the critical raw materials, but also the semiconductors. Here, over-dependency means if you have one country that is the major supplier for this critical good, that therefore has a monopoly or quasi-monopoly on the supply of these goods. Here, we agreed that we will coordinate and partner to diversify our supply chains, so look for other suppliers worldwide. I give you an example. In critical raw materials, we are looking for others who are able to provide critical raw materials. For example, in Latin America, they are mining, but the value chain often is then in China, so the monopoly for the processed goods is in China, and our dependency high. Lithium, 97% dependency of the European Union on Chinese lithium, while the origin is partially in Africa, or, for example, in Chile, or, for example, in Argentina. The second element that is important in the de-risking is that, as I said, the vast majority of products and goods are without any difficulties, but if we are looking at cutting-edge technologies in quantum computing, in biotech, cutting-edge semiconductors, for example, AI, there we have to be careful that we do not have a flow of these cutting-edge technologies to countries that use it to increase their military capabilities, countries where we have our concerns. And finally, we have developed, partially also together, instruments that we can use, for example, the instrument of foreign direct investment, the inbound investment screening, or an instrument of anti-coercion. We have seen how Lithuania, for example, suffered of the coercive measures China has taken against Lithuania. With that, the European Union, protecting Lithuania, developed the anti-coercion instrument. This shows the whole concept of economic security, started by Japan, but now also responded on the European side.
Deux points rapidement.
2 points very quickly. On the first question, so access of European products to the Japanese market, there are 2 main sectors there where we've committed. So beef and fruit and vegetables. And we are talking about phytosanitary standards there. And then on economic security, well, there's a democratic process in the EU following on from the debates that took place in the G7 on economic security. So the Commission has presented a communication. There was an initial debate at the European Council a couple of weeks ago, and we've already mapped out the path forward. So we want to be proportionate, well-targeted in our actions, and we want to maintain the benefits of an open economy, but at the same time, there might be risky situations, and those risks need to be reduced. So interdependence, over-reliance, over-dependence, and that can make us more vulnerable. So over history, we've seen the abuse of dominant positions, and this causes difficulties. So the EU might become very dependent on certain materials, strategic materials. So we have to think about what we can do to counteract that. So this means that in the coming weeks and months, we'll continue discussions, and the Commission will then make a legislative proposal at the end of the year. So this is a starting point for the debate, but there is still work to be done. So Member States will be very much involved in that whole process, and this is something that will also be conducted in close partnership with all of our friends and partners.
Thank you.
はい、私からも一言いいですか。
May I say one word on this?
Regarding the import of agricultural products from the EU, we're happy that EU made the decision to lift import restrictions on Japanese food. This was based upon science, and the key is to make all decisions based upon scientific expertise. So the same will apply to Japan. Japan will make a judgment and decision based upon science on semiconductors.
You also asked me a question on the semiconductors as well. With regard to Japan-EU cooperation on semiconductors, on July the 3rd, the MOC on the semiconductor was signed. And also at this summit today, views concurred on semiconductor supply chain cooperation, R&D, advanced skills, as well as building an early warning mechanism to respond to semiconductor supply chain disruption. Based on the Japan-EU agreement, efforts and initiatives will be taken. Thank you.
Prime Minister, we'll take a last. Yes, Stuart, we'll take a last question there.
Thank you very much. Stuart Lau from Politico. First of all, a couple of questions for Prime Minister Kishida. On semiconductors, Japan recently joined the US and the Netherlands in imposing semiconductor restrictions against countries including China. Do you expect Japan to carry out more of these kinds of restrictions on China or other countries? And Do you foresee a future where Japan will be coordinating with the EU rather than only a member state on this kind of restrictions? And a very quick question on Ukraine, if I may, for the Prime Minister. What do you think about the idea of using frozen Russian assets for the purposes of Ukraine's reconstruction? And for the two presidents, on critical minerals, China recently announced export restrictions on gallium and germanium. I'm wondering whether this topic came up in the discussion today and how much of an impact this would bring to European businesses, and would the response be considered in the light of anti-coercion instrument? Thank you.
Prime Minister.
First of all, with regard to the semiconductors, as I said to you already, Japan EU had signed a MOC on the semiconductor, and based on that, cooperation will go on. And this does not suppose any certain countries in mind. It is that Japan has just presented its basic policy, meaning that we do not suppose any certain country for having prepared this policy. I would like to remind you about that. And also, you asked about gallium and germanium. And going ahead, in what way concrete move will be seen? Well, this has not been confirmed yet. It's yet to be seen. China and other relevant countries, in what way they will come up with concrete responses is something that we will watch very closely. And following that closely, we like to figure out our thought on what it should be. Thank you.
Sur la question.
On the question about the announcement made by China, I think that just proves that we're right. For some time now, we've been saying we need to diversify our supply chains. And we've analyzed in an objective way the consequences of this announcement, what the repercussions will be, and what possible attitude could be taken by the EU on this. But once again, this just proves that we were right in the EU and our partners to focus on diversifying our supply chains.
What the critical raw materials, gallium and germanium, are concerned, China was clear that it is a response to the semiconductor issue. And indeed, they announced that they take the first step to put those two critical raw materials on the list of export controls. In the first days, as far as I understand, of August, they will take the decision whether to implement. So what we do right now is, and this is a typical process in a situation like this, that we clarify who is dependent, what sector exactly is dependent on these critical raw materials from China. It's the clean tech sector, but they're specific who has what kind of dependency, what supply chains are concerned, and then very important, who else is offering these materials worldwide, and how can we diversify our supply chains, specifically, for example, for these two critical raw materials. This is also the purpose of the Critical Raw Materials Club that we are in the process of forming, so that we have a faster response for this type of coercion, that we have a better overview who can help us step in with supply of, for example, this type of critical raw material or other products. This came from the experience that we had not only in the pandemic, but also the dependency on Russian fossil fuels, where all of a sudden Putin cut 80% of the pipeline gas in 8 months. And there we learned how important it is to have different, reliable, like-minded partners. This is the process that we are now doing to prevent these difficult situations.
Thank you, Madam President, Mr. President and Prime Minister Kishida. This concludes our press conference. Thanks again. Can we have a joint...